All right, hi and welcome everyone. I'm going to use this opportunity to focus a little bit on how I created this new track, which is actually a part of a series of tracks called Pattern Jazz. The first series is, I believe, 3 or 4 parts, and it's called The City at Night. And it starts based on a video loop, which you will see playing in the particular song, and it's this loop of a city, and that is actually from a site I subscribe to called videoblocks.com. And one day I was just typing in a keyword, city and night, and I wanted to see what would come up, and a variety of different images came up. And so essentially what I did was I chose 4 images that I thought were pretty evocative. They're actually video loops, and I use this site quite a bit for other videos that I do for my features on themed and immersive spaces. If I need some stock footage and so forth, it's pretty wonderful. I think it's like $149 a year, and you get unlimited downloads. So I've been trying to use it more and more in some of my music videos because there's evocative stuff. There are images, or videos rather, that are shot from different places all around the world. There's some pretty artsy stuff. In most cases, these are fairly short video loops. So what I typically do is I will download a loop like this and then bring it into Final Cut Pro and create a longer loop out of that by doing reverses and sort of connecting the seams of multiple versions of the same clip. So it started really with the video, and I'm trying to suggest in doing this series that I'm trying to create more of an interplay in terms of performance between what I'm doing musically and what's happening with the video. In addition to the video loop, you'll see it come up in a few places. I record some footage of my modular setup, and what I try to do is use an iPad and an iPhone just as a bit of an aesthetic, backdrop that has the same video loop playing. So that's like the second version of that loop. And it comes back in a few other places. I might take the original loop and blow it up and sort of do some things with it in terms of effects or composition. And then when I record the solo track, which I'll talk about later, I do the same thing. I actually have my instrument set up in front of my Mac video screen, and I use that as the backdrop. So it's the idea of trying to get the video loop, which is pretty simplistic, right? It's not that lengthy, and as I said earlier, I have to really modify it and think about some interesting things visually, but I wanted to use that as the thematic that connects the different parts of this piece together. So what I did was, once I had this loop, I put it on my screen and I worked on playing through my modular, and I specifically had in mind a series of 10 or so tracks based on quite a few different sound modules in my Eurorack setup. So things like plates, plonk, pluck, which all have different sonic approaches or characteristics to them. Some of my other sound generators, including, I believe I used the Pico Voice. And I might have put some of the sounds through various effects on my modular system, my Pico DSP, perhaps my Fusion VCO, which really I think of in a lot of cases as an effects unit just because of what it does with the tube sounding distortion that is really cool when you do the audio in. And I try to then just over time develop these sounds. And I also then, in addition to having a particular sound in mind, so in some cases I might have thought I want a particular drum loop or I want a metallic sound, I try to then create different sequences using primarily my Pico trigger, which I have 2 of those, and I find them very useful to create just a simple trigger, and then through the use of multiple forms of modulation, either inputting into the sound module, such as the volt per octave or the harmonic input or whatever, you create additional rhythmic variation or stutters or ratchets or whatever. And so once I started working on one individual sound, I tried to use my various trigger sources and modulation sources to alter that rhythmically, sonically, and so forth. And I should say you'll hear quite a few In addition to plonk and pluck and plates, you'll hear two sample-based units sound devices that I find very useful. One is my Tip Top 1, and the one is something that I've been trying to find a use for. So I finally did, using actually some samples I took from some of my Native Instruments sounds, and I essentially I sampled those and turned those into miniature drum parts or loops or synth sounds, loaded those into a big card, and then as I went through one, I was able to just use the file selector and choose a sound that, in terms of its timbre, would match what I'm doing with my other sound sources, my more synthesizer sound sources. And then I further changed that by using the CV routing into the module to affect the rhythm even more, or the timbre of the sound. So you'll hear quite a few loops playing throughout this particular composition, and the one main loop comes from the Tip Top module, and the second one comes from the Music Thing modular radio music. And I believe in this particular version I had it set up with some alternate firmware, and I think I was using there's a sine wave alternate firmware that's pretty interesting. But you can essentially throw in anything. It's one of my favorite modules that I've gotten recently, and they're really inexpensive, just around $100, and you can turn them into the chord organ version or the radio music, and it just has such a unique sound because of how that module is set up with the stations. And when you adjust the start point of the sample and the station and control that through some CV modulation, you just get some really rhythmic potentials. And for me, that was what I was trying to do in this new series called Pattern Jazz, is to create new rhythms and new timbres based on the power of the modular setup. And I think for me, it's some of the first instances for me of being able to do that successfully. So what I essentially did was I recorded the entirety of, it was around 35 or 40 minutes of a track, start to finish, with my modular. So I did that, and then I had a series of tracks, and you actually can see them down here. I actually took I took all of them and put them into Logic and did a lot of post-production. In some cases, I might have had a particular pattern like this one from one, and then I did a second version of it just to get something sonically differently by using various effects on Logic, just all kinds of reverbs and all kinds of different effects that added new rhythms or filters or different sources of modulation. So I essentially turned these into what you could call stems if you're familiar with Ableton. And so I essentially use those stems to create this composition. So once I had all those done, once I had all those various sound sources, I thought I'm going to start from the beginning, lay out 40 minutes or so, 30 plus minutes of this particular video loop, and just see how the mood takes me. And so I knew at the beginning I wanted a particular droney sound, and so I laid the whole thing out. And after I did that, and you can see it's pretty extensive, and I'm doing in here, actually, when I'm setting up these tracks, I'm often splicing things and putting in a section, and then it allows me, because if you just look at the waves here, you could see that in some cases, a sound is too loud. In this case, they're all going to look probably pretty equal. But I'm able then to go in and quickly adjust the dBs of any of these individual tracks. Once I've done that and I have something that is pretty interesting, and it almost seems to fall into different sections. You'll notice, for example, around 24 and a half minutes, I just happen to be at that exact point right now. There's something sonically I think that's quite interesting. And then again, later around 31 and a half minutes rather. And that's where it goes into a slow part. So I was kind of interested in creating different sections, and it just really happened organically when I was laying out these tracks. So I had everything laid out. I added some of my modular video in here, and I wasn't too interested in having everything synced. There's not a lot of me performing in this particular rhythmic backing track. You'll see a lot of my performance in what I'm calling the solo track. But essentially, I laid all these out, and I went back in and adjusted, as you can see, the curves here, the fade ins, the fade outs, adjusted the levels, and so forth. And then the second thing I did was I actually went in, selected the track in Final Cut Pro, and went to the audio enhancements and did quite a bit with, say, surround, the ambient setting, and so forth. It, in a couple cases, took a kind of dull sounding part of a stem and just popped it a little bit. It gave it a little more life. And so I experimented with that. Also in Logic beforehand, I tried to do some of my panning there. I could do the panning in post-production and Final Cut, but I did that ahead of time and then altered it yet another time, as I said, with some of the audio effects. Not a lot of, reverbs or anything, but just some of the spatial effects that allow you to do surround and panning and front to back and that kind of stuff with stereo. So that was another side of doing this, and really my inspiration was to try to say, let me use Final Cut Pro as a layout and composition device, because I really wanted to look at the interplay of the video loop and the video sections with the actual tracks. And it just was a new approach for me. I haven't really used Final Cut as essentially a layout system, a mixing system for my tracks. First time I've done it. I usually would have everything laid out as one stereo track. That would be it in Logic, and then I would have it all perfect and then import it in. This actually, I think, has some advantages just in terms of making something organic, and you can really fine-tune things here. Of course, you could do that in Logic as well, but in my mind, this allows for a little greater organic relationship between the video and the audio portions of this particular song. So that being said, once I had all that done, my final thing with this first Pattern Jazz and all the Pattern Jazz selections for The City at Night, which again will have 3 or 4 parts, was to say I need a solo instrument on top. So I sat down, I listened to the tracks, I played with a few instruments, and I think what I'm going to do is each one will feature a different, what I'm calling a solo instrument. Essentially, if you will, improvising on top of the rhythm tracks, and I think that's why I'm calling it Pattern Jazz. But what I found when I tried, say, my wind instrument, my WX Yamaha, it just didn't work with this track for whatever reason. The timbre, the rhythms, just what I had developed with the backing tracks from the Eurorack didn't work. And I finally came across my instrument, which I built some time ago. And this is a string instrument that has, on the top, as you can see, a series of dulcimer strings. On the sides, I have some bass strings, some guitar strings. I have a spring as well. And it is mic'd with quite a few piezos on the inside that I attached, and then I just have quarter jack outputs. And what I wanted to do in this case was I actually took 3 outputs, and you'll hear this in the solo track. So I'm taking 2 of the piezos. One is going as a straight signal, and in post-production I added some reverb and some other effects to it. The second is also the piezo out going into clouds, set at about 60-40, so 60 wet, 40 dry. And I'm using the Parasite firmware with clouds, and I'm finding it to be absolutely just amazing in terms of creating some very unique tonal experiments. And you can actually check that out on some of my other tracks recently, including Abstraction 1 and Abstraction 2, which are on my YouTube channel as of now. So I found that it just created this amazing timbre, tone, and so forth. So what I did was, as I was playing through, you'll actually hear me in a few places where I'm playing the instrument and I'm adjusting the size, density, texture, and particularly the pitch knob, which gives you these cool sweeping sounds towards the end of the song when I'm doing some more string bowing. And I should say, in addition, I use the Blue microphone to mic the instrument to give it a different timbre. And then I did a left and right split and created a stereo sound using this and then one of the dry outs, which I actually affected later from the homemade instrument. So you get 3 sounds, essentially 3 sound sources from this homemade string instrument. I should say, as I'm playing this instrument, I'm using it in 2 main ways. One is as a percussive effect. So I hit it in various ways with these sort of craft store spongy things that you use for plant compositions when you're doing planners and floral arrangements, and it's just a very soft thing to hit the strings with. And I have that on a wooden skewer, so that's like my percussion mallet. So that's one use, and I also do that on the side of the instrument. My second use is a bow, and you'll see this throughout where I'm bowing the instrument, and actually my bow is a cheap one. It's kind of falling apart, so if you have any suggestions on a good not going to break the bank bow, let me know in the comments of this video, because I'm always looking for something better. So I have the dulcimer strings. I'm bowing it on top. I'm bowing it on the sides with the bass strings. And I think in the end it turned out sonically kind of interesting. There are sections where I think it drags a little bit, and I'm always thinking about how can I better do some of the miking on the instrument, and what can I do with the bow. And I'm not a string instrument player. What can I do with the bow in terms of creating some interesting sonic possibilities in the future? But this is the first time using this as an instrument in this sense in a track. You can check out some of my other videos where I talk about building it, and I do have some other examples of this particular instrument that I created from scratch. So I think that's all I wanted to say about Pattern Jazz 1. At the end of the video, I describe how I created this. I filmed it on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera using a vintage Russian Meteor lens, which I think lends a particular interesting look to it as you watch the video. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this. This is the first of many tracks that I'm calling Pattern Jazz.